Welcome to our panel on the secret power with this highly secretive and suspicious cabal of people booked by the Clifton Festival. There are obviously all sorts of dark connections between them that you can work out as the afternoon goes on. My name's Anne McElvoy. I'm senior editor at The Economist and a broadcaster for Radio 4, and it's just my job to guide this panel through conspiracies, new, old, hoary, and possibly occasionally true. So let me tell you who they are. Many of them will be known to you anyway because they're all so deservedly famous and glamorous. To my immediate left, your right, is David Aaronovitch, columnist for The Times, presenter of The Briefing Room for Radio 4. We sometimes cross in a corridor there. There's conspiracy number one. He's the author of Pseudo-histories, a theory of modern conspiracy theories, so extremely well qualified to tell us a bit more perhaps about where they come from and what are the accompanying phenomena that make some conspiracy theories fly and others not, something that interests me very much indeed. Nick Cohen writes for The Observer and often appears in The Spectator as well, so depending which way you're minded, you've definitely encountered Nick Cohen's writing. He's published What's Left, How the Left Lost Its Way, and You Can't Read This Book, Censorship in the Age of Freedom, which also has some connections to the topic that we're going to discuss today. Hallie Rubenhold is author, social historian, broadcaster. She has specialised, and I very much enjoyed her writings, derived from women in the French Revolution, but her book really that's most relevant to this is her latest, and it is The Five, published earlier this year. It's a biography of the victims of Jack the Ripper and longlisted for the Baillie Gifford Prize. And I'd just be very interested, Hallie, also in how you go about researching something about which there's just so much folklore that the myth seems to overtake the story and the verifiability. So that's perhaps an angle we might dive into a bit later with you. So I thought we'd put them to work straight away and ask everyone, and I've got one here, what your favourite conspiracy theory is and what it tells us. David Aaronovitch.
I should say straight away that most of the things that people call conspiracy theory, I will find a way of discovering for you why it's not true. When I first published this book, Pseudo-histories, which Anne just referred to, and I put the prospectus before the publishers, they said, yes, they said, but it would be so much easier to sell if you were going to say they were true. And I said, yeah, I can see that, really. But being fascinated in what people believe in. So when I say my favourite conspiracy theory, it's not one I believe is true. It's one that I believe has some of the most fabulous ingredients of a conspiracy theory. And that is the one about Princess Diana being murdered by the British state, or more particularly some combination of the Duke of Edinburgh, Tony Blair, MI6.
We could have asked Richard Dearlove, couldn't we, if he did it?
And Richard Dearlove, who actually did give evidence to the inquiry that was held on the death of Diana, and was cross-examined by Mohammed Al Fayed's lawyers and Michael Mansfield. And so I think that's my favourite. And it's my favourite really because people really wanted to believe that a princess couldn't die as a consequence of something as mundane as a road accident. So it was very much there. And to believe in a theory so determinedly, which would have been thwarted had somebody put on a seatbelt, was a real kind of, if you like, kind of a real determined act of belief. And it wasn't done by some set of peculiar foreigners who are kind of prone to this kind of fete of the vapours. It was believed by lots and lots of ordinary British people like the people in this room, and it may even have been believed for a while by people in this room, and only they know. So that's why it's my favourite.
Anyone like to counter very quick? You should all shout back at the panel. Anyone who thinks that he's talking nonsense and there might be something in it?
Anyone think that, but is too frightened to admit it? There we go, at the back there.
There's 1.5 hands there. It's very hard in a room.
She's half out the door back there.
Exactly. I was even worried about the consequences. Nick?
Well, I hope I'm not giving Anne's trade secrets away, but she did actually tell us in advance that this would be her first question. And I was thinking about this, and I don't have David's expertise, who does, and I was thinking of some. But then I realised that the conspiracy theories I think about most is the conspiracy of silence. I've come to realise, and it's pretty evident looking at the world now, at Britain, at America, Russia, that one of the hardest things to do is to say, look, there's this really cranky group of people out there. They're odd, they're unpleasant, they have a conspiratorial mentality, they explain all their setbacks, all the troubles of the world by some power that makes no sense at all when you look at it. And you start saying that. I've had some experience of this because I wrote a book on what was going on the left in the last decade. And I was saying, well, look at these people. Look at these people who are just everywhere in academia, in left-wing journalism, they're not traditional leftists in the sense that they have a left wing, that they will support other people. They won't support feminists in Iran. They will support the Iranian government. They will support anyone who's anti-West, however right-wing or fascistic they are. And David was shouting about the same thing at the same time. And at the time, people would say, and BBC editors would say, well, yeah, well, hold on a second, but this doesn't matter. These are just cranks you're talking about, and now they run the Labour Party, and they yet run the country. Again, I didn't do this, but if people had been writing about ultra anti-Europeanism, even 5 years ago, and saying we could end up in a situation where this obsessive hatred of Europe can become a kind of conspiracy theory in that everything that was wrong with Britain was blamed on it. And this would lead us to a situation where, frankly, in 2 weeks, we would not only be leaving the EU, but we would be leaving without any kind of deal at all. Again, I would have said to them, I'm not blaming editors of the BBC, I would have said to them, but that's just nuts. Come on, they're not that important. It's very, very hard with, you should go for these movements. The best time to go for the type of movements that David writes about, that I write about, the best time to go for them is when they're weak. But when they are weak, you can't get anyone to take much notice of them. And then they take power, and in some countries, certainly in Hungary now, I'd say, which relies on almost classic anti-Semitic, with modern twist, conspiracy theory about the vastly powerful octopus-like Jewish financier George Soros, who is bringing Muslims into Europe because he hates and wants to dilute white Christian culture and destroy white Christian culture. It's probably too late in Hungary to change it. And the great paradox is that you have to take these things seriously early, and stamp on them early. And I rather suspect the generation that's lived through the past 3 or 4 years, if we ever get out of this mess, which we may not, but if we ever do, will be far more willing to stamp than my generation was.
Hallie.
Well, it's interesting Nick was mentioning conspiracy theories involving the Jews, because one of the things that I've been looking at historically is a conspiracy theory, is a pseudo-history, and the difficulty being a historian and approaching pseudo-histories, and looking at, not in this particular book, but peripherally around it, the kind of famous banner headline pseudo-histories that there are, usually that Hitler escaped the bunker, the JFK assassination, like Jack the Ripper, Anastasia Romanoff running around. And interestingly, they all contain one of 5 things. Either the Jews are blamed, the CIA is blamed, the Soviets are blamed, a royal family is blamed, or the Masons are blamed. And I think you can tick every box. The conspiracy theory one of the conspiracy theories that I had to contend with, because it governs what I think is called modern ripperology, which is what I had to confront when I started writing this book, God, first of all, what is ripperology? Ripperology is the study of Jack the Ripper, and it is a thing, believe it or not, and people take it very, very seriously, because at its core there is a conspiracy. And that is, there was a book that was written in 1973 by a man called Stephen Knight called Jack the Ripper, The Final Solution. And Jack the Ripper for the Final Solution was a book that Stephen Knight wrote based on an interview he did with a man called Joseph Gorman, who said he was the descendant of Prince Albert Victor, okay, who was the future Edward VII's son, who apparently had syphilis, and a model, a life model from Walter Sickert's studio. Okay, this is where it starts. And apparently Prince Albert Victor secretly married this woman called Annie Elizabeth Crook, then had a baby with her, okay? So that means that this child, and Annie Elizabeth Crook was Catholic, and that this child would be in line to the throne. So the powers that be got very upset about this when they found out about it. Everybody had to be silenced and, you know, put in their places. And that meant that Lord Salisbury, the Prime Minister, had to feel around with the help of his friends, the Masons, who were, you know, a lot of them were in Scotland Yard at that time, working with Metropolitan Police. They had to kill Annie Elizabeth Crook, kill the child, but also the witness to their marriage, who was Mary Jane Kelly, who was the fifth victim of Jack the Ripper, and then the three women who Mary Jane Kelly had told this about, who were planning to blackmail the government because there was a new heir to the throne. And then they hired the royal surgeon, Sir William Gull, to go into the East End and pick up all these women, kill them in his carriage, and then drop them in parts of the East End. Never mind the fact that they never managed to kill Annie Elizabeth Crook at all, or the child. But somehow this was believed, and this was the explanation for who Jack the Ripper was. And the whole thing was then disproven, okay? But the problem,
No, really?
yeah, the whole thing was, well, first of all, but the idiotic thing is, if you know anything about history, the one thing that you can say, stop right here, the Royal Marriages Act. Because the Royal Marriages Act means that nobody can get married without, no child of a sovereign can get married without the sovereign's permission. Any marriage surrounding that is null and void. So there would not be a legitimate heir to the throne who was born on the wrong side of the bed. So, I mean, that's just blown out of the water. But never mind the fact that that is completely bedded in, and it's bedded into our culture to the point that this is the mother of all Ripper conspiracy theories because it's inspired Patricia Cornwell. Patricia Cornwell's theories are based on this theory. From Hell, you know, which is the film and the graphic novel, is based on this theory. And so most people will come to this and talk about this conspiracy theory.
But I think that's very interesting for all of us to reflect on. Oh, I was going to do mine, and then I'd like to dive into the power of narrative. I mean, you're talking about it, and Tony, you're saying, oh, this can't be, clearly can't be so. And I'm thinking, this is an amazing narrative. You know, who's not going to buy this series, right? You know, whoever was coming up with this stuff, you know, now would have gone straight to Netflix, wouldn't they? And they'd have been, you know. So you can also see that the upside of this is storytelling. This is storytelling from the ancient Greece. Oh, it's all true about Oedipus, you know what I mean? So there is something that feeds into narrative. I'm going to give you mine, because I came in very late from Kiev when I've been following the Trump-Zelensky story. And this sorry, only relevant to those who've got very good eyesight or in the front row. But this is under pressure. Trump-Zelensky phone call starts impeachment probe. And this is a marvellous picture of Mr. Zelensky, president of Ukraine, looking incredibly uncomfortable. The look he's giving Trump is like, what am I into here? But that's a very interesting example of a news story, which clearly has a truth and a not truth to it. It's a real thing. It's not a pseudo-history, where conspiracy theories now abound immediately, straight after, about Trump was making that call. He may well have been to put pressure on a political rival, on Joe Biden. It would seem to be a reasonable assumption that was the case, or that he was doing it in some way to pull strings for President Putin, and that's all to do with his dealings with Moscow in the past. That's a good example where you could have reasonable views that said, yeah, you know what, he just is, whether one likes it or not, in hoc to the Kremlin, or another one that just says he's a chaos muppet. Yeah. And so I would just like to sort of test a little bit, going back round to your stories, of where do you feel, where was the cliff edge of your own certainty? I know on Princess Diana, you said you love it because you think it's so clearly not true. But when you were working on other conspiracy theories, David, did you ever come up against something where you said, well, actually, I do feel there could be more truth in this than, or a different kind of truth? Maybe that's what we're getting at.
The dramatic thing about doing the research for the book was I even on the way discovered that conspiracy theories I was inclined to believe in were rubbish as well. So
right,
to take
give us a confession then.
So to take a classic one. Well, I mean, and it's also interesting, it's generationally interesting what conspiracy theories you have tended to lean in towards. So, for instance, for centre leftists of my generation, it was a sine qua non that JFK was offed by a conspiracy. And it's when you kind of look at it harder that you realise that's nonsensical. But you've believed it for a long time. Everybody remember that Woody Allen scene, I think it's in Annie Hall, but I can't kind of remember, where he's talking about conspiracy theories. And he says, politician, that's one step below child molester. I know, we kind of forget that. But one of the things that I think people have been taught at school until fairly recently is that the Reichstag in January 1933 was fired by Hitler and then blamed, or by the Nazis, and then blamed on the communists. Actually, that's almost certainly a conspiracy theory. It almost certainly was set actually by a guy called Marinus van der Lubbe, acting on his own, who was a deranged Dutch communist who was, for fairly obvious reasons, fairly pissed off. But the Comintern was superb at creating a story about how the Nazis had done it. And we did and people then do the classic, what they call the cui bono test, which is a false test if ever there was one. Who benefits, etc. Well, who benefited from the fire in the Reichstag? Hitler did, because he uses it as an excuse to crack down upon everybody. Ergo, Hitler set fire to the Reichstag. So the terrible truth is, I mean, there is one conspiracy theory like a conspiracy theory, and this is not to say there are not lots of conspiracies, but they're not conspiracy theories, which is the Levon affair, in which, and also Suez actually comes pretty close, because lies were told in the House of Commons about a secret deal with Israel, which actually really did exist with the British and French governments. The Levon affair, where they actually did one of the very few examples of what they call a genuine false flag operation, where they set off bombs in Cairo, pretending that they were the bombs of... it actually didn't work at all. It was a very unsuccessful campaign to pretend that they were the work of nationalist Egyptian extremists.
But that's a good example of something where, as you say, you thought overall you were less inclined to believe conspiracy theories than even ones you'd maybe given attention to. And I suppose the only reason I'm looking a bit sceptical is that some things must happen that are connected, that one doesn't see are connected until subsequently. Sometimes there will be stories or even a mythology around them which one could very easily dismiss. I remember when I was writing Marcus Wolf memoirs, he was a very powerful head of East German intelligence, very close to the Soviets, and had a 40-year career. So he was a sort of go-to, he was a sort of the Richard Deal up on the other side. And he actually, over a lot of time working on this memoir, actually confessed that at one point they were so desperate to prove that there were neo-Nazis running around for a particular reason in Berlin at the time that they planted some. Now, if I had read that earlier, it was shocking. I mean, it was amusing, but also the many things that he sort of came out with, I thought that was really pretty shocking. I didn't think they would have done that. But if I had been, say, a strongly anti-communist journalist, and he'd been Soviets would sponsor this kind of thing, people might well have reasonably said that's just a baseless conspiracy theory. So, Nick, I only throw it over to you to say, how do we know when we're looking at these things? We can either take it as read that they're mainly wrong, but should we have a bit of doubt in our own minds that some of them might be right?
Yeah, two doubts. One doubt you should also have is a conspiracy by definition can only involve a very few people. So when you have, whatever, on the left you get it, the entire tabloid press is, right-wing press is engaged in operations who brainwash the working class with false consciousness, and, or on the right you get it's the same said about the BBC in reverse. Conspiracies by definition must involve a few people. The other thing to look out for, because you asked about yourself, about things you come across yourself, is your own cognitive biases on how we all want to believe things that suit our prejudices, that suit our political prejudices, which the charlatans of left and right of the past decades have really, really worked on. And to give an example of this, I had one this week. A few weeks ago, a journalist, I think his name was Otto English, ran a big piece that went haywire on social media, on Twitter, about how Johnson was backed by hedge funds run by Odney, and these people were disaster capitalists. They were going to bet against Britain. They were putting their bets on the hedge funds and saying and putting their money down and counting on Britain crashing out of the single currency, the pound plummeting, inflation go up, and they would clean up on billions. Now, being rather against Brexit, I really wanted to believe that was true, and very against Johnson, probably more against Johnson than Brexit. It's hard to say. Depends on how I feel in the mornings.
Charitable.
I resisted that. Then yesterday in David's paper, The Times, Philip Hammond, the former Chancellor of the Exchequer, said, well, you know, Boris Johnson is backed by hedge funds run by Richard Odney who will clean up, who have bet against Britain, will clean up. Rachel Johnson, who's Boris Johnson's own sister, said it on The World at 1. And I've really had to, I just retweeted pretty much without comment what Philip Hammond had said. You know, because I thought, well, it's one thing, you know, some woke journalist on some online newspaper saying it. When it's a Tory former Chancellor of the Exchequer, perhaps you should take it a bit more seriously. But I want that to be true. I want that to be true and to use that as a stick to beat what I think is a disastrous turn our country has taken. Those are the ones you have to resist. It's the ones that play to political prejudice. And to go back to what you were saying, Anne, the ones that play to your narrative prejudice as well. See, I fully understand why, if I'm a filmmaker, yeah, absolutely, we're going to get the royal family and exact the Ripper story. You know, what do you want us to do? A crime scene drama, late Victorian crime scene drama, and we never even catch the suspect? You know, don't even know who he is? No, that's fine. But there is, I'm sure David can talk about this better than me, there is a type of mind that picks up on conspiracies. I don't know if it's right to say that people who believe in one will believe in many. But it's certainly my experience that people who will go on and on about the Jews, or sorry, the Zionists, you meant to call them these days, on the left, controlling the world, will go on and on about the MMR vaccine. And in the case of Corbyn's brother, will then say climate change isn't real either. You know, I wonder if I'm right on that. Is there a mentality where if you, is it like a one in, all in, really, with some people?
What do you think on that, David? We'll come back to Hallie in a second.
What the idea that if you're entirely open-minded, you have nowhere for your brains to go. And I think it's difficult to say, honestly, because your first point, which I think is really pertinent, is that if you take something like, was 9/11 a conspiracy, an inside job? The vast majority of people who believe that would identify on the left.
Yeah.
If it's a ridiculous, absurd, and baroque theory, but nevertheless, that's the way we go. If you look at the people who believe that Barack Obama, was not an American citizen and that somehow or other that was faked up, they're overwhelmingly on the right. And I think we can guess that by and large, the people who believe the Barack Obama thing have a section of people who don't believe the 9/11 theory. And so I think that speaks to your earlier point, which is I think it's right that you do have. I mean, there is a kind of mentality that delights in being the person that tells you that the moon landings weren't real. And most of us know when we've come across one of those, at a dinner party or drinks or in the saloon bar, etc. I'll tell you how it really. And there is definitely that as well.
But they do wander across the political divide, perhaps a bit more than we're reflecting. And it's interesting you mentioned MMR vaccine. Now that was one that I think really started on the kind of get the big state out of my space. So it's not on the right of American politics, a particular form of the right of American politics, which was anti-big state. I want freedom to run my own life, decide what happens to my own kids. But has actually crossed. So you do now find a lot of people who are on the left who are very sceptical about and don't believe the evidence and believe that the pharma companies have got involved. It often correlates quite strongly with homeschooling, and that also tends to move, started on the right, has moved a bit to the alternative left. So I would suggest that they're a bit more like shoals of fish sometimes, and they can cross the divide.
Well,
Hallie, what do you think?
Well, I was just going to speak to that point. In fact, David and I were having a conversation in the green room about what generates the need for a conspiracy theory. What is it in a person? And we were saying, which speaks to this, which is this concept of lack of control in one's own life, that there are larger forces at play that determine our lives, and we have no control over these things. And somehow it gives us, or maybe not me in particular, or maybe because, as you were saying, Nick, we are prone to believing things if it suits our own prejudices. So where there is a kind of gap in information, and where one feels that perhaps the world is not working the way one wants it to work, and here's an explanation. There are these large bodies, and these large bodies take control of things. And the reason why my life is not the way I want it to be, or the world is not the way I want it to be, is some external factor, and you can blame it on that. So there's always somebody to point the finger at.
Yeah.
I think that, sorry.
Go on, please.
No, I think, and this is, I'd like to make this point, and I make it every time I'm on talking about fake news and the power of the internet. We do have to remember that 10 years ago was the greatest crash since 1929. That real wages in Britain have not increased since 2005. That the public, the taxpayer, had to bail out the banks. And then the taxpayers who bailed it out and then suffer cuts in public services, tax rises, and whatever. In the 1930s, there was no internet. There wasn't, but that's a worse condition of circumstances, because the 30s depression was far worse than what we've been through. Two of the greatest conspiracy theories ever, Nazism and communism, where the whole bourgeoisie is conspiring against the working class, and if only they can be destroyed, we'll have paradise on earth. Pretty classic one. Were in power, and I do think that, as well as Hallie's reasons, it's not just a mental thing. It's not just people feeling powerless. It is, we are living through times when society isn't working for most people, in the sense that our parents understood it, that you'd have a pay rise every year, you'd have a decent pension. And in those circumstances, it is, I at least understand why people latch on to, if not classic conspiracy theories in David's sense, big things. Get out of the EU, that's responsible for our problems. Bash the bankers who rigged the system and vote for Corbyn, then everything will be, and then austerity ends and everything will be fine. I think you do need. I think these things do change with time, and there are certain periods in history of which this is one, when they're more likely to get a purchase.
David, what Nick has described in nicely boiled down ways, it's like an economically rooted view of where conspiracy theories may come from, or at least when they thrive more. So I just wondered, when you were writing voodoo histories, did you come across other sort of factors that you think are particularly important? I'm always interested, having written a bit about miracles, and when religious miracles arise, that often you might think they would come out of times of economic strain. They tend to come much more out of civil conflict. You should be in a civil conflict or at the end of a nasty war, often with a bit of nationalism suppressed. Preferably in somewhere quite mountainous, so you tend to get Medjugorje, and people spent a lot of time in Medjugorje, sort of in the Rocky Mountains, and apparently this is not unusual. So I wondered if we would just move away a little bit from the idea that economics can explain a lot. Did you find there were other factors that just seem to occur?
Well, I mean, if you think about it, if what we're looking for is supervening explanations for events which are troubling or difficult to explain, then I think it's change itself, which could be or significant change or difficult change. And so one of the things that really fascinated me was with the great anti-Jewish forgery, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. So here's a pamphlet that was actually produced before the First World War by the Russian secret police, which is to try and explain why they're having all these problems with active opponents. And if you can link them to the Jews, who are unpopular just about everywhere in one kind of way or another, you can therefore kind of damage the liberal causes themselves. So they create a forgery called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is based on a book that's actually written in the reign of Napoleon III Bonaparte in France, and they change it to be the Jews. This book doesn't take off until after the First World War. The First World War finishes, most of the empires of Europe have fallen, and all of a sudden, people say this publication goes absolutely viral. It's the nearest thing to a kind of internet virality that you can imagine in the kind of pamphlet era. It's sold everywhere. The Times has an editorial saying about it, well, this is suspicious, we'd better inquire into whether this is true. Winston Churchill is inclined to believe it, and all on the basis that we've had these incredible changes and revolutions, the Russian Revolution and the First World War. Who could have done it all? Well, the answer is who could have done it all was you did it all, because you all went into Trafalgar Square and to the school in Vienna and said, yeah, let's have a bloody great war. But you don't want to say that now. Now it's all kind of disastrous. You're looking around for somebody else to blame. Who benefits? It's the Jews. And that's how that one happened.
Yeah.
Hallie, we must come back to the five, and you've dealt with women in history. You've often foregrounded women in history in your writing and in your broader work, in events where possibly the narrative has often been quite male-driven. And in this case, of course, women very tragically at the heart of it as the victims of Jack the Ripper himself. What difference does it make to the narrative, to who believes it, to who spreads it? Do women believe as much as men about this in the case of what you describe as the pseudo-history that you've excavated?
Well, interesting. I mean, it's again, I think we spoke briefly about, David and I spoke briefly, and I hate referencing conversations that happened in the green room, but about who are conspiracy theorists, who are at the heart of this. And largely, I hate to say it, it tends to be about 90% white male. And then there are, there's...
Are you sure about that? Just
Yes.
I'm always fascinated when people stick it up. I work for The Economist here.
Yeah.
It hasn't got a graph or a chart
Well, no,
on
it absolutely hasn't.
But you could actually
Yes.
show me some data on that.
Well, I could not show you some data, but I could refer you to a couple of Ripperology forum sites.
Is that only in Europe there? I mean,
It's in America.
What about in Zimbabwe?
And in Zimbabwe.
Or South Africa?
I don't think they're that interested.
No.
No, I don't think that they're that interested. I think this is definitely a kind of Anglophonic interest. So you get interest in the United States, and you get interest in Britain, you get some interest in Australia, and largely they are men, I found, and some women who are very sort of, I often compare them to like women in biker gangs, where they have to show they are even meaner and ruder than the men, and they see themselves as the keeper of the flame. They are the people who defend this truth. And because I was seen as an interloper, and actually one of the interesting things about conspiracy theories and the internet is now the internet has brought a lot of conspiracy theorists together, and they have forum sites. And they can communicate on forum sites, and these forum sites become communities. And then there are outsiders, and they think often that this community is under threat. And because I was not part of this community, and I wrote this book, which contradicts a lot of what they're saying, they see me as an interloper, and there is even a conspiracy theory around me now.
Of course there is.
So apparently I'm a BBC plant who has been put out there to rewrite history in this kind of leftist way, feminist way, because obviously that's what the BBC does, is it pays people to go out and rewrite history and, indoctrinate all of us.
In that case, not enough, David, right? We can say that.
Yeah.
But you ended up then as being, when you say a target, I'm not surprised they're not fond of what you write.
Yeah.
But do you feel that is it in any sense, because then a worldview is threatened, is there any edge which people know themselves that it's not quite true, but they elect to believe it? The psychology of it really interests me. Are there people who, we've talked about as if belief and non-belief were absolutes, But we all have bits. I mean, religion's a good example.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people who've gone to church this morning who sort of believe it but don't believe it. Is that also true of conspiracy?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, ripperology is a religion. You know, it is a dogma, and I have questioned this, and because of it, it's like I'm going to be struck down, and I have been cast out. I've been excommunicated. And on one of these forum sites, there is a thread that is 260 pages long, ripping me apart and my book apart. That's just one forum site.
Okay.
And I am the Antichrist of ripperology. But
is that going on the back of the next edition?
it is.
Because they would buy that, right?
It is. It is. But I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I think, as we were saying, I think perhaps what has given fuel to so much conspiracy theory in this day and age is the internet, is the fact that all of this can be communicated so quickly and amongst communities.
I wanted to come in specific. The Voodoo Histories book I finished 10 years ago. In one of the chapters, it takes up a thing that Cass Sunstein, who was an advisor to Barack Obama, and a considerable kind of believer in things like nudge theory, who was doing himself about polarization, which has since then become a completely accepted view of how, essentially, how people polarize themselves once they join groups and so on. And in the book, what I'd said was that people will find each other increasingly on the internet. Now, what I actually, at that stage, still thought that the capacity of the internet to debunk conspiracy theories was going to be as significant as their capacity to create them. But that was before social media.
Right.
And what social media did, it rendered groups of people essentially not available for the debunking, but only available for the conspiracism. Yeah, for bunking. They were only up for the bunking.
Up for bunking. And elegantly phrased. Nick, so what is the way through this? So landing you with the solution seeking, just as perhaps the last 5 minutes, and then we'll open it to the floor, and you can share your favourite or unfavourite conspiracy theories and what you make of them. Is there a way through this that says that, given that we do live, and unfortunately in the West, in reasonably prosperous and educated societies, we know that a lot of people are marginalised from that, and that's partly drives a lot of phenomenon we're just becoming more broadly aware of. But is the answer that we do get smarter over time, or we don't? And if so, where do we? Where is the hope here?
Right. Well, that's a nice, easy
Professor,
question.
Professor who knows everything.
Well, right. I think at a personal level first, I think I've come to the conclusion there's no other way in my business of journalism, certainly in news journalism, than just to keep doing news in the old-fashioned way. And there's all kinds of people shouting at us the whole time, saying, you can't say this, you can't do that, that story's inappropriate, blah, blah. Just keeping doing news, straight, hard news, is terribly important. It may not be very effective. It may, as David says, you can live in the world of ripperology, and nothing. The best researched book in the world, most footnoted, academically respectable book, will not change your mind. In fact, it will just make you angry.
Absolutely.
But to go from the personal to the slightly political, it depends what you do. If we're talking about one thing, you're trying to deal with one thing, like you're trying to deal with Trump at the next election in America, and you're against Trump. I mean, might be people in favour of him, but if you're generally people against Trump, how do you deal with Trump supporters? Then you stick by Michelle Obama's, they go low, we go high. But you start looking at people and start saying, well, who's the hardcore? I do this whenever I'm in line with people. Who are the hardcore? Wherever you say, you're never going to change your minds. Whatever you write, there are people on that thread. You could put them in a time machine and take them back to Whitechapel on the very day and say, look, he says it's all a lie.
Yeah.
But then who's on the fringe? What I dislike so much about modern politics is, and in the Sunstein polarization that David's describing, is one side's this, the other side's that, and they hate each other. And they don't live next door to each other, they don't marry each other, they're appalled if their kids marry someone from the other side. But who are the softcore of, say, Trump? Invent an opponent of your choice if you don't like the Trump example. Who are the softcore who can be persuaded? and what do you need to do to speak to them, and what arguments do they have, this is a bit where you should always make yourself accountable, which may have some truth in, which you haven't thought about. What concessions are you prepared to make? Beyond that, at the meta level, society level, I think you have to have media literacy teaching at school, and beyond that. I think right the way through the education system, you have to be saying to children, to teenagers, to students even, this is how fake news works. This is how lies work. Not using it to impose a political view of a teacher, but just... I
don't think that would take very long to happen.
No, I don't think so either. But you can see the point of that. Or even programmes on the BBC, how it works.
Yeah, how it works and what's going on behind the scenes. But then people will tell you that that's conspiracy too. Just a very, very quick thought before we go to the floor, and then David. Feminism, does it make any difference? I mean, what you've described, and that sort of slightly sickly fascination with something which in the end is about sort of violent sexual death of young women, still seems to have this extraordinary narrative hold on the imagination and is tipped into many conspiracy theories. And yet we often talk about a century of huge change for women. Do you see that as two things as being in any way related, or do you just think that they're addressing two completely different groups?
Well, I mean, I don't know. I mean, again, I think, we're talking about left and right, and often, the left will blame the right for preventing, major change from happening. I don't know. I think, by and large, I think there's just a huge, right now, mistrust of the press. And I think people are trying to find their own way through that. But I was going to say, well, one of the things that Nick mentioned, which I think was so interesting, is this idea of media literacy. It wasn't that long ago in this country that we used to scoff at the idea of people going to university and doing MAs in media studies. Oh, and now, I mean, how relevant is this? I think we have lost our ability to think critically in this country. I also think we're bombarded with so much information all the time. And one of the things that I faced when I was writing this book was, I mean, the very, very basic need to be able to analyze sources. I mean, there was fake news in the 19th century as well. And I'm looking at newspapers. Often, in many cases, there are only newspaper reports available. Well, what can this newspaper tell me? And can I cross-reference it with documents that are much more reliable? And that's the basis on which I did my investigation. But I think a lot of people, and what I certainly find with ripperology, is that fundamental understanding of which sources are more worthy is completely absent. And I think this is, in many cases, across the board with most conspiracy theories. It's just, a newspaper is weighted the same as an academic text, as a government document, and, and God forbid there should be something redacted in that government document, which makes it even more suspect. But, I mean, there has to be that ability to analyse critically.
David, sorry, to jump in too quickly.
No,
and then
I just want to say you can't draw a neat dividing line between old media, somehow good, and the internet, bad.
Yeah.
I mean, the Daily Express will often have classic fake news as mad as anything you'll find, as false as anything you'll find on the web about chemtrails or what have you. There's no neat dividing line. Something isn't true because it's on newsprint.
Yeah. David, as a supremely rationalist columnist, one can agree or disagree with a particular column that you write, but do you have a feeling you're sort of crying in the wilderness when it comes to this? Or do you believe that your day job, which is to put well-crafted, thought-through columns, often sort of trying to engage an argument and even risking a rough reaction, that they do in some way help offset the voodoo histories?
I honestly don't know. I mean, in a way, you get to the point where, like Martin Luther, you say, here I stand, I can do no other. I can't imagine a world in which we give up trying to say it as we see it. I can't. I mean, you occasionally get this argument, which is telling people the thing that they don't want to hear makes them cling to the thing they do want to hear even more. Yeah. So you shouldn't say it. So what do you say? Do you just say, oh, well, that's an interesting theory, and then back down and say, that's complete bollocks, by the way, but and so there is a real kind of difficulty. I agree very much, very, very briefly, with what both Hallie and Nick have said. about literacy and so on. So, for example, this morning on the Mail on Sunday, there's a story saying that the number 10 says that some of the Tory rebels have been in cahoots with the French, it's usually the French, in order to deal us down. You have to go through quite a lot of that story before you discover number 10 official offered no evidence for this contention. But by the time you get there, the story's already been told. I want to get to the stage whereby the first thing anybody looking at that story looks for is the line that says, number 10 couldn't identify any evidence for this story.
Yeah.
And the next question you then ask was, well, who is this anonymous source in the first place? And every journalist in Britain knows it was Dominic Cummings. And he didn't have any evidence for it, and he just said it. And that actually, if there is a story, is the story, and so on. And that's why you need media literacy.
Yeah.
Let's throw it open to the floor. We've got microphones going around. Give us a wave. Come on, you can work hard. It's Sunday afternoon. We need some help here. Great. Good. Come on. Give us some challenges as well.
There are two incidents on which your views would be interesting. The first was, if you recall, in the run-up to the Iraq War, one of the key issues was whether or not Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. And that was followed shortly thereafterwards by the apparent suicide of Dr. Kelly. And although it was written and officially deemed ultimately to be suicide, there was some very sound medical evidence that the way it was described as having been could not have been physically possible. And that has never been resolved or explained to the best of my knowledge. The second and much more important one is that at the Wannsee conference, the decision was made to initiate the Holocaust. That was a secret conference, and it was never, and the decision was never announced afterwards that they were going to exterminate the Jews. Would you not deem that to be a conspiracy?
Yeah.
Nick first.
I've read a guy called Peter Oborne on the Mail wrote a piece still insisting that David Kelly didn't commit suicide. And someone, I think it was David Aaronovitch, then took the trouble to write 5,000 words explaining why this is the biggest pile of steaming donkey poos ever to be received in national press, and why and how the murder of David Kelly, how David Kelly's murder had been constructed, how the lie had been built, to the great upset of his family, incidentally. So I thought David would do better at answering that. Your point on the Final State Conference, yes, that's true. One wider point I would make about it, however, is this. There was an American diplomat, ambassador to the UN, Patrick Daniel Moynihan, who said, he said it better than I did, but he said words to the effect of, the more free a society is, the greater the complaints are about human rights. What he meant was that it's only in free societies that you can report on abuses of power, that including state murder. And within dictatorial states, totalitarian states, it is far, far harder. So yes, it was a conspiracy, but the Holocaust, but it was a conspiracy involving tens and tens of thousands of people. But the problem was, you can do that in a dictatorial state. This is, the modern thinking about famines as well is the same. You only get famines in dictatorship. There were massive famines when the British ruled India. As soon as the British leave, famines stop, because the society is open, there's represented government, and however badly the Indian elites behave, they know they cannot tolerate a mass famine in which 3 million people die, as they did repeatedly under British rule. So that there is a slight distinction between saying a conspiracy, there's a difference between dictatorships and democracies. You can have an awful lot of people involved in a conspiracy and dictatorship, and the world sort of doesn't know about it. Anyway, I'll hand you over to David on David Kelly.
One thing I want to whisk round a little bit, because we've maybe got a couple of other questions to get in our last 10 minutes, so I will encourage the panel to be a bit haiku-like in their reflections. I think, David Kelly, is that one for you?
Yeah, it is. It's very difficult for me in haiku-like, but I will really attempt a bit.
The
biggest haiku is, if you buy the book, this book, Pseudo-histories, you'll find an entire chapter on it. but just to say, to quote from the British Association of Forensic Medicine, Dr. Alan Anscombe, anticipate the line of argument from these pathologists, not the pathologists, from the orthopedists and others who'd made this observation in the Guardian you're talking about. He said, while forensic pathologists are biased in terms of seeing what people actually die from, there's nothing problematic about the notion that he committed suicide from a combination of cutting his wrists and taking coproximol tablets. And in fact, in these days of the kind of thinking about opioid overdoses, it's interesting to note that coproximol is no longer on the market because people kept accidentally overdosing on it and killing themselves. It really is as simple as that.
Right, let's take a couple of... Hallie, I'll come to you on the next round if you don't mind. I just want to hear a few more voices from the room. Yes. I think I can see, yes, a hand. And if you've got a hand, I'm happy to hear from you. Thank you.
Is that against handless people?
Yeah, of course, I've done it now, haven't I?
Can I say, that's it. One of the things I've found in my working life is that conspiracies are very quick to get off the ground because people, Facebook groups and whatever, get together, invent, kind of take their take on things. And the state, in my case, the local government side, has to take time to put an answer back. And so the conspiracies run miles ahead of you before you can actually all get round together and say, well, that's not right. And meanwhile, they've moved on to another aspect of it. So just interested to hear what the panel thought.
Let's take another question as well, because some might suit some panelists better than others. Yes, sir. Just a gentleman at the back. I should give you the microphone lady a bit more help. Hi.
Thank you. Just to pick up with the point about media education and also about the barrage of news that's out there nowadays, which often isn't news, it's just glossed up as sort of entertainment. So I remember a stat around at the time when Trump was elected, which was something like 5 or 6% of the American population had read an article online that was longer than about 5 minutes, i.e. no one knew anything about anything. The point about there's so much news out there which isn't really news, but we're all being influenced by it. So the thing that I don't quite get, and this is probably to do with being a liberal society, is that the sort of power or lack of power of the press complaints authority, which I think is self-regulated, so it doesn't really have any teeth. And in the internet, I'm not sure we have any teeth for anything, so anything kind of goes. So I don't quite get now how many years into the internet. We still don't have something that helps.
Yeah, no, I can
people
sort of your argument is you need much more sort of strong top-down regulation. Is that fair? I know that it's probably not an area that's germane to you, but I mean, if it sparks something on how tough should one be really on conspiracy theories, Hallie?
Well, I think it's an interesting point. I think one of the ways in which, in the absence of any kind of regulatory body for the internet, and I just don't know how that would ever come about, I think we have the duty as citizens to learn critical analysis, to be critical, to always say, where is this coming from? What is the source? And it is so difficult because we are so barraged with media stories. And, there may be a story that emerges in the media. And because there are so many news outlets wanting to break stories so quickly, and things aren't double-checked, they're just broken. And so, often, I find myself going on to Twitter and seeing who's broken a story. Has Laura Kuhnsberg said something, has Tim Shipman said something. And then, often you'll find out who is a little bit more cautious and who will break things immediately. I don't know, I even find it very confusing in this time, and I like to think of myself as quite media literate, media savvy. But it is confusing. I don't know. What do you think we can do aside from? Will there ever be a regulatory body? That's probably a terrible idea.
Well, as Anne was suggesting, you're sort of getting away from conspiracy theories. One thing I think, Twitter, Facebook, social media, 1990s, Bill Clinton administration, he gave them all a massive free pass. He said they weren't publishers, so the editor of my newspaper is liable for everything he publishes, and he can be sent to prison for contempt of court. The paper is responsible for it. Facebook is not responsible for the publishers, and they said they're more like telephone companies. Just as a telephone company isn't responsible if some pervert starts phoning up women and heavy breathing down the line, whatever. It's not the telephone company that's doing that. Facebook is not responsible. I do think, and I noticed that the Committee on Standards and Published Life, I was writing about them in the paper this morning, had said in their reports about violence against politicians, political activists, has recommended to, they have to be made liable if they know and have reviewed threats against, well, we're talking about political candidates, could be anyone in this room, and they said, no, we're leaving those up, then they should be as liable as a newspaper editor is for that. I guess the lady over there was talking about how difficult it is. You just have to publish a reply. You have to do what David did with the David Kelly conspiracy theory. Some poor sod has got to sit down, read it all, and then map out precisely why that's wrong. And just put that out there and hope enough people read it. There's nothing else you can do.
And David,
Exactly.
we do have our own minds. That was just a... Yeah, so we do have common sense, but we're talking also about manipulation of people's sense, common or otherwise. David, I wanted to just a quick word on regulation, the gentleman at the back. Journalists and media regulation, often a relationship like between cats and water, isn't it? And the idea of a supreme external regulator, as opposed to us telling each other off, which we're actually really good at, is something I would say overall journalists have a bit of an uneasy relationship with. Where do you come down?
It's far. It's obviously far too big. I mean, when these organisations say they're not publishers, this is in a sense kind of force majeure. They are literally putting up, or people are putting up, billions of pieces of information every day. So you can't conceivably edit it. It's not possible. I mean, a newspaper is a relatively limited thing. The Facebook is an almost completely unlimited thing. So what you do is you gradually begin to look at those particular areas that cause you most problem and insist that they deal with those. Child porn would be an obvious first one, encouragement to terrorism. Each one of them is incidentally fraught with its own kind of difficulty, because you then have to trust the people who are doing the taking down to do taking down in the right kind of a way. And if you're in the wrong country, such as China or Russia or Iran, the taking down bit, i.e. the bit that they say is the fake news, or is the bit that actually is inconvenient to the government and that they don't want up. I don't think there's any substitute in the end. You can do a bit of that, and some of it you've got to do, particularly around violence and so on. But I don't think there's any substitute to what the woman is saying in the front row, which is we have to encourage people, as far as possible, to use their own good common sense. Yes. I mean, after all, they don't go about their daily relationships on the whole as if there's some kind of deep, dark conspiracy. They know there's not at home. They know that their husband doesn't... They know their husband doesn't do the things he does because he's in cahoots with the next door neighbours. They know they do it because he's a bit of a dick. I mean...
It depends what mood your teenage children are in, whether that's true or not. Do you have a very, very last question? If there's a very short, would have to be a pithy one with pithy answers. And that, she said sternly. Thank you.
I have a sort of a comment that hopefully will inspire.
Can you just shout up, or the mic?
Yes.
Thank you.
Given that we have presidents and prime ministers who lie, I mean, I think that the latest toll is 13,000 from Trump since he's been in office. And, obviously politicians on both sides are not being held to telling the truth. Don't you think we live in a time where lies and conspiracy theories, which are being promulgated by politicians, it has made it more commonplace?
Right, it's the politicians what done it. Quick thoughts from each of you. Hallie.
Oh my gosh. Well, I mean, we live in a time, I mean, we've never seen anything like this. So I think the question is, where do we go from here? I mean, how do we monitor this? How do we check this? Usually it's down to the fourth estate to do it, to check out these lies. And a lot of newspapers are doing that. There are very reputable publications. But I think part of what the Prime Minister, I hate to say it, and the Trump administration are doing is trying to undermine our legitimate publications, our legitimate fourth estate, and throwing question over them. So nobody knows what is a reliable source of information. That's incredibly dangerous.
Do politicians really lie more now than previously, or spread doubt and conspiracy more, Nick, or are we just more alive to it?
Blair certainly lied, but he will react very badly and go to great lengths to try to prove he hadn't lied. Trump, Corbyn, Johnson don't really care as long as their own supporters don't believe it. To answer your question, it's not the lying politicians who bother me, it's the people who believe them, and the people who want to be lied to, and the people you can't shake out of it. And that's why you need to split them up. You need to isolate the hardcore and bring over their moderate supporters.
Last word to David Aaronovitch.
I think this is a really pertinent question. Again, when when I wrote Voodoo Histories and did a chapter on American conspiracy theories and the one on birtherism, every single reputable Republican repudiated the Barack Obama conspiracy theory. In the year the book came out, Trump endorsed it, actually came out in support of it. What I didn't realise at the time was that was an incredibly important message to a section of the Republican base that he represented their sorts of prejudices and their kind of feelings. And it was that then took him to the presidency, that and the peculiarities of the American presidential system. There is something unique in post-war history that has happened in the West in the last 5 to 10 years, which has been the election and the use by elected people in positions of power of conspiracy theories that their predecessors would have said themselves represented disqualification from office. It's really serious and it's really bad.
Well, I'm sorry we can't end on a more upbeat note, but I think we have at least had a good excavation of what the secret power is, from the world of Jack the Ripper to the times that we live on both sides of the Atlantic today. Nothing connects our panel apart from a vast conspiracy I could tell you about afterwards if you buy me a drink over in the bar. You should see really what's going on. More germane is they have these books on sale, which, as you can see, they're very shy about, so they just put them on the desk in front. So please go over and have a look at their books, and I'm sure the author's very happy to engage you in conversation, unconspiratorial or otherwise. I'll be back in about half an hour to discuss British politics, what's not to like. Thank you.
Okay.